Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our attendees joining us today for this latest Data Science Central webinar. This is Bill Voorhees, your host. I'm the editorial director with Data Science Central, and I'm also the chief data scientist for Data Magnum. So I'd like to start off our event today by thanking Tableau for sponsoring today's event. Tableau is an integral supporter of the Data Science Central community, and we're honored to have them sponsoring our event today. I'd also like to take this opportunity to mention and show our appreciation for some of our other recent sponsors, including HPE Vertica, Alteryx, Dell Statistica, IBM, Teradata, and Exaptive, to name just a few. Now, our past webinars are available on demand at datasciencecentral.com. If you haven't had the opportunity to view them, I encourage you to take a look. They provide very useful insights into a wide variety of topics of interest to our data science community. So today's webinar is entitled Communicating Analytic Insights Visually. And before we begin the webinar, I'd like to briefly review the format. So in today's event, it will be an hour long. We have two presenters that I'll introduce in just a minute. There'll be 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A following the presentation, and this event is being recorded and will be available on datasciencecentral.com later this afternoon following today's live event. Now, I'd also like to encourage our attendees to provide questions throughout the presentation. We'll be reviewing and presenting them on your behalf during the Q&A portion of today's event. Well, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speakers, Jake Kinstler and Alex Cortez of Tableau. Now, Jake is a product consultant with Tableau and holds a bachelor's degree in English and a master's degree in creative writing. Jake's an avid rock climber, lives in Seattle with his cadre of rescued animals. Now, Alex is also a product consultant with Tableau and holds a degree in physics from the University of Texas at Austin. He's always had a thing for data and now immerses himself in it daily. He loves working with customer data and building actionable dashboards that inspire change within organizations. So Jake, Alex, thanks for being with us today. We're looking forward to your presentation. There's more to your dashboard's appearance than meets the eye. A well-designed dashboard isn't just a pretty picture. It's a powerful tool for communicating data-driven, actionable insights to your audience. So how can we use the science of perception to make our visualizations more effective, compelling, and delightful? So in today's Data Science Central webinar, you'll learn how to build intuitive dashboards that inspire users to interact with and learn from their data. So in today's webinar, we'll cover the following topics: how visual cues can obscure or reveal critical information, the impact and proper deployment of data types, how to ask the right questions to properly focus your dashboard, common mistakes, visual best practices, and hands-on dashboard critique, revision, and creation. So Jake, Alex, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. You can begin as soon as you're ready to go.
Thanks, Bill. So my name is Jake Kinstler.
And my name is Alex Cortez.
And we're going to begin this session on visual communication by talking about doors. Yes, doors. So you see a door in front of you, right up here on the screen. I want you to just type into the chat or think to yourself, if you saw this, how would you open it? Yeah, so it's actually a push. I know it doesn't look like it. You have to push this. It looks like a few of you got it, but a lot of you said pull. All right, how about this one? Push or pull? Yeah, it's actually a slider. You grab that little handle there and you pull it to the right. Okay, last one. I believe in y'all. You can do this. How do you open this door? Now, this one is a little bit more interesting. Now, I found this image and this story on a blog. Someone had written an entire post just about this door. So this guy, he's at a bar. He's having a great time. And because he's having a great time, he needs to go to the restroom. So he grabs hold of this knob to get in, but it doesn't budge. It's stuck solid. He sort of twists it, turns it, and nothing happens. So finally he thinks to himself, okay, I just need to brute force this, and throws himself against the door and trips and falls on the floor when it swings open effortlessly. Because it turns out that in Australia, the fire code demands that doors to bathrooms have to swing open. They can't latch shut. So the owner of this bar decided to glue a doorknob to the front of this door for quote-unquote decoration. Are you starting to see what doors might have in common with dashboards? Doors are objects we encounter every day. We have to interact with them to get where we're going. And a well-designed door will tell us what action we need to take without us even realizing it. We just push, or we pull, or we turn, or we slide. But when a door doesn't effectively support an action, this happens. You get frustrated, you pull the wrong way, you look like an idiot in front of your friends. Now, there's one crucial difference between doors and dashboards. People have to use doors. Even if they're poorly designed, they have no other options to get where they're going. But they don't have to use a dashboard. If interacting with a dashboard is a frustrating, counterintuitive experience, people will stop using it. They'll find a way to get around it. They'll go back to Excel. They'll dump their data into something else. They may stop trying to work with data altogether and just go back to what feels right or what sounds right. So today's session is all about giving you the tools you need to design dashboards that get used, dashboards that get passed around, and dashboards that communicate insights. Because a highly effective dashboard really just does two things, and really should only do two things. It should communicate a message, and it should suggest a course of action. It should say, here's what's going on, and here's what you need to do about it. Now, I'm going to repeat that, because if you take nothing else away from today, I want you to take away this. A highly effective dashboard communicates a message and suggests a course of action. However, you can't just create a beautiful dashboard or just communicate an insight. If you have a great dashboard that shows that profits are down by 40% in the East, it's pretty, it is really insightful about these profits, but stops there, well, then what do you think to yourself? Great. Now what do I do about those profit losses? Now you need to convert that insight into action to actually create a data-driven business. You need to create a dashboard that says, we're heavily discounting these 20 high-selling products in the Eastern region, and it's losing us money. That's why our profits are down. When you look at a dashboard, you should be able to respond to it and generate change. A great insight without action, without something you can do about it, is like a pretty door with no handle. You know what's going to happen? Eventually, your end users are going to stop trying to get into that door altogether. So, what do we want you to take away from today's training? Well, first, we want you to articulate how the principles of visual perception can create more effective analytic communication. Now, that's a mouthful. All I'm trying to say is Alex here is going to teach you how to harness the way your brain actually consumes visuals, how the brain is hardwired to see different types of data differently. But the articulate part is also important because I have a dream that every single person is creating good dashboards with actionable insights, and every business is data-driven. But I can't do that by myself. So during this training, I'd like you to think about how you would explain these principles to one of your coworkers, and maybe just try to spread this one level further. I also want you to be able to actually design a dashboard that communicates an insight and suggests a course of action. So after Alex walks you through the principles of visual perception and how to actually create dashboards at the micro level, we'll take a step back and I'll talk about how you actually put those pieces together to create a dashboard that communicates a message and suggests a course of action. So this is a brief overview of our session. We'll be asking questions, sort of talking in general about a lot of things. If you have any questions, like Bill said, go ahead and put those in the chat, and we're happy to answer them at the end of this session. And with that, let's go ahead and get started actually getting away from the abstract and into the concrete. So Alex, take it away.
Thanks, Jake. I'm really pleased to be here with everyone today. I personally think and believe that, the things that you can learn in this session could be of great value to you. These are things that we might know, and they might seem simple enough, but we're not actively conscious of them when it really matters. We're designing our dashboards. So I just want to get straight into it, and I want to start by asking you this question. What prevents us from understanding? And I mean this in the context of data visualization. What prevents us from understanding? Well, let's look at a couple of visuals. So here's a visual. It looks like two squares sitting on top of each other. And we can look at it this way. There's another way we can look at this. If you place your finger over the gap between the squares, so on top of that line, you look at it differently. What's different? Well, it appears that the colors are the same when our finger covers up the line. When our finger comes off the line, they look like two different colors. So what's going on here? Well, the information that is available to us, but we fail to see, is that both squares are the same color. So there's something being lost here, okay? There's some information that is lost to us when we just look at this picture. Let's try another viz. So here's a ball covered in spikes, right? Wrong. It's just black spikes, and your mind is creating a ball that doesn't exist. We want to make sure that our visual designs are showing us exactly what's really there, and not what our minds insist should be there. So these are two examples that show that visual design and communication is something to be studied and understood, and not taken for granted. So what's common to both of these examples? Shortcuts. Our brain is using shortcuts, okay? Shortcuts are what allow our brains to process visual information at an average of 60 gigabytes per second. To put that into context, that's like downloading 45 movies a second from Netflix or Amazon. I mean, it's an insane amount of information transfer. So we're talking about shortcuts that our brain uses to be efficient. And some of these shortcuts we call pre-attentive attributes. These are things that you say, boom, I get it, I don't even have to think about it. And they can be used to your disadvantage. So for example, magicians use this lack of thought process to trick you all the time, and we fall for it. But I'm no magician. I don't think Jake is either. And we're here to show you examples of pre-attentive attributes and how to use them for your advantage and not your disadvantage. So what are these pre-attentive attributes? Give me a concrete example of what a pre-attentive attribute is. Well, here's a table listing all of those pre-attentive attributes. So again, these are the things that enable our understanding. Our brain processes each of these with no thinking required on our part. So let's just go down the list. Everyone here has used a bar chart before. And so we're looking at length and width when we talk about bar charts. It's easy to see who the longest bar is or which one's widest. Following that, you've got orientation, curvature. Think time series analysis. How would someone represent that time series data? Well, usually we're looking at lines and the shape of those lines. Are profits on the rise? Are sales on the decline? Then we're looking at size, and we'll dig into that later. Shape, enclosure, position is a big one. Spatial grouping, color. We're going to dig into color quite heavily. So, okay, I've listed out these pre-attentive attributes. What do we want to do with them? Well, we want to encode our data, okay? We want to leverage these properties that don't require any work from us, okay? We want to weave that into our data visualization skills. So the question now is, how do I use them? How do I encode my data? Well, it helps to know what type of data you're looking at. And there are different types of data. So typically we see 3 different types of data. We're talking about categorical data. So think, how do I categorize this data? By state, by segment, and so forth. You have ordinal data, which is anything with a linear pattern. So A, B, C, D, excellent, good, poor, 1, 2, 3, so forth. And of course, you've got quantitative data. So this is what you can do math on, okay? Averages, sums of sales and profits, and so forth. So I've given you what the pre-attentive attributes are, the things that you want to leverage. I've told you what your different data types are. And so now I'm going to tell you how to link those two. So here's a table that tells me exactly that. This is how the pre-attentive attributes that I listed before are tied to those 3 different data types. Now what is the first thing you might notice about this graph? Well, I think most of you would say position is at the top universally. So what this chart is telling us is that position should be leveraged every single time, regardless of the data type that you're using. That's interesting. It's a good rule of thumb to have. And it might be interesting as well that length, size, and color, things that we typically use every day and we find valuable, they're towards the bottom. So what's going on there? Well, we're going to dig into that. Okay? So I'm going to switch over to Tableau here, and I'm going to share my screen. Now, if you guys have trouble seeing my screen, I would recommend refreshing your browser. That typically takes care of that issue. And so I believe now most of you should be able to see my screen. Again, if you can't, just refresh your browser, and you should be good to go. So I'm in Tableau here, and I told you that position is the most effective pre-attentive attribute to use, regardless of what you're looking at. So let's see some examples of that in Tableau with real data. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at Pokemon data. Okay, a lot of people here at Tableau are big fans of Pokemon Go and all that. So I decided, let's use this data set. It's freely available. So each bar here indicates the strength of that Pokemon. So my question to you is, who here is the strongest Pokemon of this subset? Well, you can tell me pretty quickly that Dragonite, this guy here in the middle, is the strongest Pokemon. Now, if I asked you who's the second strongest Pokemon, it's not so easy anymore. Is there a way that I could determine that? Well, turns out if I sort, then I know that I have 3 Pokemon tied for second place. I can say that with confidence now. So have you guys ever thought about why sorting works? Well, you know now. The reason is because you're leveraging position and length. We're leveraging pre-attentive attributes, things that don't require work from us. It's trivial, but it immediately gives us insight that we didn't have before. Let's look at another example. What about quantitative data? Can I show you that position is the most effective attribute to use in quantitative data? Well, I'm going to compare 2 metrics. We're looking at attack on the x-axis, defense on the y-axis, and each point here is a single Pokemon. So what insight can I get just by looking at this? Well, I can tell you who my weakest overall players are. They're down here in the bottom left. I can tell you who my strongest attacking Pokemon is. He's all the way over here to the right. I can tell you who my strongest defending Pokemon are. They're up here at the top. And I can tell you who my average players are. It's all these guys here in the middle. So I've identified 4 different players, 4 different groups of Pokemon. I've answered 4 different questions, and I did that in a matter of seconds. And so this is where Tableau is particularly strong. So our engineers have designed Tableau to make use of those pre-attentive attributes, to leverage those attributes for you. But it helps to know about them yourself. That goes hand in hand. With a strong product and the knowledge of these pre-attentive attributes, you're able to really build some stunning but insightful visualizations. Okay, so we talked about position. Why is size less effective? Okay, well, do you guys remember doing perspective drawing in art class when you were, I don't know, 5th or 6th grade, maybe even before that? You walked in, your teacher had a big piece of paper in front of you and said, we're going to use these rulers and we're going to draw railroad tracks that vanish into the distance. You're going to draw buildings on either side, make them smaller and smaller. Do you guys remember that? I certainly do. I bring that up because it's relevant. I want you to look at this visualization, okay? And I want you to tell me which of those orange circles appears to be bigger. Well, let me tell you something else. If I had a 2-year-old here and I asked the 2-year-old that question, they would say, they're both the same size. Your question doesn't make any sense. So why am I asking you guys that question? Well, for us it does make sense because we're all tricked into thinking that the one on the right looks bigger. Every single one of us. So why is that? Because clearly they're not. It's because we're using perspective. All our lives, we've been trained to use perspective. This is one of those shortcuts that I was talking about in the beginning. Perspective is important for us. It really does wonders for us. But there are times like this when it actually works against us. And this is just a simple visualization. So this is telling me that the size of things around something actually affects my interpretation, okay? Small things are farther away, big things are closer. That's how our brains work through this visualization. And it's relevant now because we're actually building out effective dashboards, things that matter. So we don't want to offer misleading insight by sizing something inappropriately or by sizing things around something inappropriately. So that's the takeaway here. Be careful with size. Let's look at another example. So I'm back at my scatter plot, and I'm going to take speed. I'm going to drop it onto size. So what this effectively does is it just sizes every circle according to the speed of that Pokemon. So before I was asking you questions like, who is the fastest Pokemon? Or sorry, who is the strongest attacking Pokemon? Who's the weakest defending Pokemon? Now I'm just going to ask you another simple question. Who's the fastest Pokemon? Essentially, what's the biggest circle here? Well, you can't really tell me. Even if I zoom in, it's hard to make comparisons. I can't definitively tell you which one of these Pokemon is the fastest. And this is a great example of how position trumps size. Okay? I zoomed in and I still can't tell you who the fastest Pokemon is. But I can still tell you, and I could even tell you before I zoomed in, who the strongest attacking Pokemon was. I didn't have to think about it. So the general message here is just be careful when you encode data with size. Maybe look towards position. Maybe there's another way you can encode that data. Okay. Let's go back to our slideshow here. And let's talk about color. So color is interesting. And everyone likes color. No one likes looking at a black and white crosstab or visualization. It gets old. So why is color so far down the pecking order? Why is it even below size? I mean, that sounds kind of crazy, right? Well, here's the thing about color. And we already know this. This isn't some grand discovery that I've made. But the truth is that color perception is completely relative. So for example, what I think is red, Jake, my partner here, might think is pink. Or what I think is black, Jake might think is gold. Do some of you know what I'm referencing here? Well, all of you guys remember this. I'm sure of it. So let me just ask you, what color is that middle dress? What two colors do you see there? I mean, right now I see white and gold. But you know, if I actually kind of stand to the side of my monitor, it starts to look a little bit blue. And depending on the quality of my monitor, you know, it might look black instead of gold. And so what you're seeing here is that color perception relies on surroundings. It relies on lighting, on angle, on the quality of my monitor, on the brightness of my monitor. It relies on so many things. And that's how we work. We perceive color. So let me ask you this question. Is it a good idea to use color on data that might have a huge business impact for you? Is that a good idea? Well, maybe, but that's not a definitive yes. Maybe 5 minutes ago, before we even started talking about color, you'd say, yeah, it's a great idea to encode data with color. It really helps things pop. But now we're already running into issues with color. So let's finish up in Tableau. Let's see some examples in Tableau using color. And then after that, I'm going to pass it back off to Jake so he can actually lead you through some real dashboards that put these principles into play. So let's look at this. We've got Pokemon types. And the darker the shade of blue, the more stamina that Pokemon type has. Okay? So we see some weak groups here, and we see some strong ones. I want you to particularly focus on electric, which is second from the top. And I want you to focus on ghost, which is down towards the middle, below bug. So ghost and electric. Now, I want you to just think to yourself, which of those looks brighter? Electric or ghost? I've asked many people this question, and I've gotten plenty of different answers. There seems to be a pretty even split. But no one has ever told me that those look the same. So why is it that when I isolate them, we find out they are the same? What's going on? I didn't perform a magic trick. Remember, guys, I'm not here to do that. All I did was I isolated the two. I can not isolate them, go back to the original view, and again, they look like different shades of blue. So the point here is that, like with size, we've got to be careful with how we use color around something so that we don't offer misleading insight. What's going on is the colors around electric and ghost are actually affecting the way you view it. It's affecting your interpretation. So you could imagine that these bars, these shades actually represented profits within different states, for example. Then you're offering misleading insight there. Because unless you isolate them, you're not actually looking at the real numbers. So maybe we should use position here. Maybe we should use a bar chart. Or even before this, we should try size, because this is worse than size. So again, just be careful with how you use color around something. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that can't be all there is to color, and it's not. There are a couple of ways that you can effectively use color, and ways that we actually recommend. So let's go over those two real quick. Associative colors. I'm going to tell you, we're looking at 3 Pokemon types: water, fire, and grass. You know immediately, without having to look at a legend, which one is which. You know that blue is water, red is fire, and green is grass. You don't have to think about it. So why is that? Well, it's because you're leveraging your long-term memory here. You've made this association all your life. It's essentially a shortcut, but one that we can actually use to our advantage here. Okay, so think about this as a quick and intuitive and powerful way to brand your dashboards. Okay, you're basically allowing your viewer to not even have to make a connection. Okay, those connections are already made. They know that blue is water, and they can get to the insights quicker. So that's why we use associative color. We want to get to those insights quicker. Now, the second way we recommend using color through the use of bright colors. So Here I've got a bunch of bars that either sit below or above that threshold. I want you to count how many bars sit above it. Now, how long does that take you? Probably 3, 4 seconds. Now, if I did this, how long does it take you now? Probably a second or less. You know that there's 8 bars there. You almost don't even have to count it. And so we're using bright colors to grab your attention. I'm leading your eyes exactly where I want them to see. You see, before, you had to check all 3 sections to see if any bars were above that line. But it turns out there are none in the top section. And when you use bright colors, you don't even look at that top section because there's no point. And that's obvious to you now. So you use bright colors to lead your end user's eyes exactly where you want them to see. And then use associative colors to get to those insights quickly without having to make connections. That's the proper way to use color. So with that, we're done with pre-attentive attributes. It's time to put these ideas together and actually build actionable dashboards. So we covered position, we covered size, color, we looked at a couple charts that you might want to reference in the future. And my part now is done. So Jake, if you want to go ahead and take over, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Alex. So like Bill mentioned, in another life before Tableau, I was a writer and a teacher. And I spent a lot of years in schooling learning about writing, about all the different parts of it, about how to communicate about it. So when I got to Tableau, and I knew that I have to do some dashboard design, I thought, you know what, I'm pretty good at telling stories, at getting people to understand what I want them to understand. I think I'm going to be pretty good at this whole thing, but I wasn't, not at first. I made a lot of those same mistakes that Alex just walked us through. I used relative color with important quantitative information. I put that same quantitative information on size instead of position. There's a reason for that. It's because while dashboards can have some text on them, they have to rely on visual communication. And we, and certainly I, don't often receive training in visual communication. We respond to it because of how we're biologically built. Like Alex said, our brain sort of understands some of these attributes at a gut level, at a brainstem level. But understanding some of these things and being able to recreate them effectively are very different. They're like understanding a foreign language versus trying to give a presentation entirely in a foreign language. So that's why we're here today. Alex just took all of us through school. He taught us the grammar and the vocabulary of visual perception. And now I'm going to take some of those building blocks and start us on that path to actually being able to tell a story and communicate effectively with visual methods. Beautiful, isn't it? This is just raw data. It's both what we're trying to communicate, and it's also going to be our method of communication. And this is great, but can we draw any insights from this data here? Go ahead and just type into the chat window if you see any patterns or notice anything interesting about this data. Yeah, I don't think, maybe if you had a couple weeks you could do it, but not in the couple seconds I just gave you. So let's start using some of the tools that Alex just gave us to make this easier to understand, to get to those insights faster. Okay, so we know that we have change over time. So I just went ahead and used orientation. And immediately, a bunch of different insights pop out. We can see that there's the seasonality before about 1960, and then a huge drop-off with a couple peaks, but mostly going to 0 after 1960. Interesting stuff. Certainly much more able to take action off of it than the previous crosstab, but this is still very high level. We had all those interesting state level information, all that interesting state level information before that we've lost. So I'd like to sort of get that back in. Let's go ahead and think about ways to do that. I could bring it to the color shelf, but then I'd be using 50 different colors and it would be just a rat's nest. So let's maybe back up and try a different method of visualization for this. Now we have individual states there down the side. We have color instead of orientation to denote the number of cases. You can see there at the bottom. We now know what the number is. It's cases. We can now clearly see that there are more cases in certain years and less in other years in certain states. But what sin did I just commit that Alex taught you about maybe 10 minutes ago? I put quantitative information on color. I'm using relative color here. So can you tell how much these cases change year to year in somewhere like Tennessee? Not really. You can sort of pick out the highlights, but that's about it. We're also really heavily skewing the color to the right end of that spectrum. There's only a couple state year combinations there that have that dark, dark color. Most everything else is too light to really be able to understand. So what can we do instead? I want to keep color here because, like Alex said, color is interesting, it's effective in certain ways. So what were some of the effective ways that Alex mentioned? Bright colors, and specifically bucketed bright colors that have some sort of basis in our understanding of culture. In this case, a green to red system bucketed into the hundreds, 0 to 5. So we're basically saying these are the scales of the outbreak, because we can now see that these are measles outbreaks. And anything above 500 cases, that's an outbreak. We don't need to do much below that. But this now allows us to see the severity of the outbreak in clear, distinct colors. And by doing this, we're not blowing out our numbers. And this allows us to see even more insights. We can see some states like Nevada never really struggled with measles. We can see that Hawaii didn't struggle with measles until the 1940s, probably World War II related. Maybe soldiers brought it there. We can see that some states, particularly Michigan, continued to struggle after that vaccine was introduced there in that black line. And we can also see how effective that vaccine was in totally eliminating outbreaks for most states in most years. Now, I want to step back. Nothing in the data changed. This is still that spreadsheet I showed you at the beginning. We just changed how we were communicating. Again, anyone could have dug into that initial spreadsheet and come to the same conclusions we just did. But how long do you think it would have taken them? And do you think they would have bothered after maybe that first easiest insight that there was some seasonality or that there was a drop-off? Remember, a dashboard is a door. And we want our users to step through that door as quickly and as easily as possible. Now, let's go for a slightly different example. This is a really famous dashboard at Tableau. It's called Iraq's Bloody Toll. We talk a lot about telling stories with data here at Tableau, and this is an effective story. It's monthly fatalities during the Iraq War using an upside-down bar chart and bright, vivid red to suggest dripping blood. To me, it's a really moving example of how visualizations and data can have an effective, moving story behind them. Except, here's that exact same view. The exact same information, the exact same charts, just inverted without the red. And it's titled Iraq, Deaths on the Decline, a totally different conclusion. Same data, same visualizations, different conclusion. We've talked a lot today about how design can clarify or increase the speed to insight, but I also want to make sure that you all understand that design can also do interpretive work. Do you think that these two visualizations communicate different messages? And do you think that upon seeing them, someone might take two different actions? It's because even though they're similar visualizations, they're different stories. They have different tones, they have different point of views. I'm sure you learned both about tone and point of view in maybe English 101 or in high school. All those things, tone, point of view, subtext that you learned about there, they exist for visual communication as well. I just want you to start understanding these pieces so that you know what you're doing. And you don't make a door that leads into the wrong room. You don't make that spiked ball. You just make the spikes. I hope some of you feel more confident about creating a dashboard that will be really meaningful for your end user and maybe better prepared to explain, remember that articulate piece that I mentioned at the beginning? Better prepared to explain the principles of visual perception as well. But I just want to really quickly touch on some of the most important takeaways that I hope you remember tomorrow, next week. First, design your dashboards for communication, not aesthetics. We didn't talk about formatting or about proper color to put the logo on today, right? We talked about how to build a dashboard that communicates a message and supports a course of action. That is what is important. That's what visual best practices really means. And it's in service of this. A well-designed dashboard should convert those analytic insights that you've found using Tableau or whatever tool you use into action that can then go and change your business for the better. And how you actually do that, how you get out of the realm of philosophy and design and everything else that I've talked about today, is you use what Alex taught you about. You leverage the principles of perception. You use those proper data types and you use them to encode the right data to communicate effectively. So that someone sees something and they understand it and they leave your dashboard and they go and they make those important decisions. But whether you're using those dashboards to communicate directly with an audience or you're using them to explore data and find insights, learning about these principles and applying them to your work, they're going to help you create a delightful experience that your end users are going to come back to, they're going to pass around, they're going to use to take action. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Alex and I will stay here and take any questions that you've put into it. But thanks for having us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bill, back to you.
Well, Jake, Alex, thanks so much for that excellent presentation. So we'll get started with today's Q&A session. And I want to thank the audience for their participation. And we've had a great many questions that have come in during the presentation, and we'll do our best to get through all of them in the time remaining. So during Q&A, I'll leave up this screen with contact information for Jake and Alex if you'd like to contact them following today's webinar. So let's get started. First question, Jake and Alex, from our audience is, one of our audience members says, I find myself using bar charts all the time and it gets repetitive. What should I do to spice up boring dashboards?
Yeah, we get that question a lot, and I'm going to give you sort of a short, probably frustrating answer, and then maybe a longer one. The short answer is, if a bar chart is the most effective chart for you, go for it. If it's a good chart and it's effective and it tells someone what they need to know, they're not going to find it boring. If it gives them information that's crucial to their job, it isn't going to be the wrong chart, no matter what. Now, that's not very helpful. So what I can say is that there are other ways you can leverage position and length if that's the most important chart for you. That isn't a bar. Here at Tableau, I'm certainly a fan of the bullet chart. It's really effective for sort of showing how close one metric is to another. You can also use heat maps. Sometimes those can be effective. And that's sort of what I'll say is that, generally speaking, if you're using a bar chart, it's because you want to use length, and a bar chart is the most effective way to do that. So don't be afraid that your dashboards are boring. If they're effective, they won't be boring.
Well, thank you for that answer. Similarly, about time series data, you talked about orientation and curvature working well, specifically well for time series data. But are there other ways to visualize time besides line charts?
Yeah, certainly. So you noticed that in my previous slide before the Iraq War one, the measles one with the vaccine data, I was using basically a heat map there to show time. It was still using a left-right axis, but it was using squares and color instead of line and up or down orientation. So heat map is one way to do it. But there are actually lots and lots and lots of different ways to visualize time. If you want to search for Andy Cotgreave, he has a fantastic presentation. It was actually at Tableau conference a few years ago called New Ways to Visualize Time. And it walks through some of the different ways, including the heat map, including sort of switching things around to see seasonality, including putting time on the y-axis instead of the x-axis. So it's a great way to see some of those additional ways to visualize time. I highly encourage it.
Okay, well, hey, thank you for that very complete answer. And, you know, a question that we almost always get about visualization. Can you give us some universal rules about types of visualizations that are always bad or always good? What should we avoid like the plague, and where can we feel safe?
Sure, yeah, I get that off of myself too. So I'll say I don't think there's ever a universally right answer. Generally speaking, it's going to depend on your data. Like Alex said, use that chart to figure out what the most effective visualization is going to be, and then sort of use your best judgment. In terms of the bad visualizations, I think there's only two visualizations that I will always recommend against, maybe three. The first one is gauges. They take up a lot of space, and they often don't have the proper context to actually evaluate what's going on. I previously mentioned bullet charts. I think they're a great replacement for gauges. The second one will be pie charts if you're using more than about 2 or 3 dimensions. If you're slicing that data by 2 or 3 different ways, using 2 or 3 different colors, for example. Much beyond that, and your eye just can't really understand what's going on with the pie chart. So I'd say using a pie chart, keep it to really 2 metrics, maybe 3. And the final one I'll say is bubble charts can be effective at a high level, but shouldn't be used with any sort of granularity. They're really good for an initial high-level overview of all your data, but shouldn't be used if you want to drill in at all. Again, circles are just harder for our brains to understand than bars or positions.
And I just want to add on to that a little bit as well. I just want to say I think 3-dimensional charts can be a little bit cumbersome to use because a lot of times you'll have high concentrations. Let's say we're looking at a 3D bar chart, for example, and you have a couple of large values. It kind of makes it difficult to see what's behind those. So in a way, it's hard to see trends across the entire plane, if that makes sense. So 3D charts, they don't reveal all of the information that they should, and that's why Tableau actually doesn't support 3D charts. So we use small multiples. So essentially, instead of representing all that information in a 3D way, represent it in a 2D way, and just have every variation that you need. So I would recommend against 3D charts as well.
Well, thanks. Those are some really useful rules of thumb, and we'll try and keep those in mind. You know, my personal experience, and I think the audience reflects this in their questions too, is one of the ways that we get inspired to make more attractive and more informative dashboards is to look at the work of other people that are really masters in the field. You talked about Andy Cotgreave, I think his name was, as a source. Can you tell us what some other sources of reference or maybe some websites that we could look at where we can see some really good and innovative examples of dashboards?
Yeah, sure. So Andy Cotgreave, he's great. He has a blog called Makeover Monday where it takes a design that isn't necessarily bad but isn't living up to its full potential. And he and a couple other really fantastic visual design artists go through and create that same view using Tableau or even just using sort of pen and paper. And it can be a really effective way to think about different ways to improve visualizations. I'll also mention Edward Tufte, particularly the visual display of quantitative information and envisioning information. Those are 2 books by him. Envisioning information is sort of my Bible. I really love it. And then Stephen Few has some great books as well. Information Dashboard Design is sort of an industry standard. If you're interested in visual design, you've probably already heard of it. But I also really appreciate Show Me the Numbers. It's an earlier book, and I think also very effective. Alex, you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think there's only one more thing I'd add there. I would throw into that mix Tableau Public. So I don't know how many of you have gone on to Tableau Public. It's essentially kind of our YouTube, Tableau's YouTube of visualizations, and anybody can post anything up there, and it's all free to look at. And a lot of times you can actually download the workbooks of some of the really interesting visualizations because people put up their best work. So I really highly recommend going to Tableau Public. You'll see visualizations on every kind of topic you can think of, and download that workbook and see how they created it in desktop. That's probably the only other thing I would recommend outside of what Jake already talked about.
Well, Jake, Alex, thanks for those great answers to some very good questions. And for those of you that asked questions today that weren't answered, we'll be sending all the unanswered questions to Jake and Alex and the Tableau team so they can follow up with you after today's webinar. You know, I have just a few quick announcements. If you'd please mark your calendars for March 21st. That's our next DSC webinar, Creating Efficient Ways to Connect Across Disparate Data Sources, and that's going to be presented by Alteryx. Also, remember that today's taping will be available for on-demand viewing later today, and you can find it on the home page of datasciencecentral.com, and the webinar tab is located at the top of the page. Well, this brings today's webinar to a close, and I'd like to thank our audience for their attendance and thoughtful questions, and a special thanks to Tableau for their sponsorship, and our speakers today, Jake Kinstler and Alex Cortez, for their insight into today's topic. Now, my name is Bill Voorhees. I'm very pleased to have been your host for today's event. I look forward to seeing you all again on March 21st. Have a great day.